Hello and welcome to Cloud Builder Live. I am excited for a lot of reasons. Now, I've been looking in the chat. Some of you might be joining from wintry Australia. Some of you, this might be, hey, happy first day of summer if you're here in the US. But no matter where you're coming from, I'm excited that you're here because we're going to do something we haven't done yet on this show. And that is that we're going to dive in and we're going to cover GCP. Now, here's the cool thing. This is totally a, hey, let's start from scratch episode. That means if you've never done anything in the cloud, not a problem. We're going to give you the tools that you need so that you can go out, you can do this on your own, and you'll be able to walk away from this saying, hey, I've got a skill that I didn't have before. And that's what really gets me excited about this episode. Now, that being said, let me go ahead and just remind you what the purpose is of this particular show. So here, we're really all about helping you actually build real solutions in the cloud. We know that some of you maybe have studied for certifications, you've gone in and learned things and you're like, okay, great, but what do I do with it? How do I actually build something real? And that's all that this show is about, is really helping you connect the dots and really learning to build stuff in the cloud. So, with this, for those of you that might be new to Cloud Builder Live, we truly build things, right? This isn't just about showing a bunch of slides and talking about it. We will be showing a few slides at the beginning, but we'll spend the rest of our time actually getting in and building a solution on the Google Cloud Platform. Now, we've done episodes on AWS. We've done episodes on Azure. This is our first episode focused entirely on GCP, but here's the cool thing. Even if you say, hey, I'm not too sure about GCP, there's still things you can learn by what we're going to be doing in this episode. Okay, so I hope you're excited about this, right? I hope you're excited to dive in. And what I want to do first is I just want to talk about what we're going to be dealing with here on GCP. We're going to want to take an API, a microservice API that we have, a REST-based API. We're going to want to deploy it. We're going to want to test it. We're going to want it to be continuously deployed from our GitHub account, right? And we're going to be doing all of that. I'll even be walking through and telling you how you can set up your own GCP account if you haven't done that. So again, no worries on where you're at in the process. But to do this, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation here in the beginning so that you can understand why we're choosing the services we are. Because again, this is one of the biggest problems in the cloud. People say, oh, there's this service, I can do it this way, I can do it that way. I'm going to walk you through a real use case where we're going to dive in and pick from a collection of services, and I'm going to explain why we're going to use what we are going to use. So, let's just go ahead and look at this. So whenever we're talking about running something in the cloud, we want to actually run some code, for example, that falls under the category that we would call compute, right? So we have a lot of different options for running compute on the Google Cloud Platform, right? So to start off with, we have something called Compute Engine, right? And this might say, okay, that has compute in it. We're going down the right path, and you'd be correct. But here's the thing. This compute engine is really targeted at deploying virtual machines into the cloud. Now, that's great, but in this case, we don't want to actually own an entire virtual machine. We want our container that I'm going to show you in just a minute. We want our container to be able to run in the cloud. So that's what we want to be able to do. We also have another choice here, which is something called App Engine. Now, we would call this more of a platform as a service type offering. It can take our application and run it. We have some configurability, and that's great. But we want to actually have even less configuration than we have to deal with App Engine. Now, another choice, one that has truly all of the bells and whistles, is going to be the Kubernetes engine. GKE, or the Google Kubernetes engine, is powerful, right? It can do pretty much anything you can imagine. You could go out and run a massive business, deploying custom software onto GKE and having that interact with your customers. Like, it truly could handle just about anything. But here's the thing, there's a lot of configuration that needs to go into that, and there's a lot of knowledge that needs to go into it. You need to have an understanding of Kubernetes. So Google knows this, and so they launched a couple of years ago a service called Cloud Run. And this particular service gives us the ability to just launch something, right? To really get in and launch our application, but without having to know all of those details that you have to know to run a Google Kubernetes engine. So this is one of the reasons why I think this is a great choice. Now, another one that I'll call out here that's a really specialized choice is we also have something here called Cloud Build. Now, Cloud Build gives you the ability to go in and actually run like a build server and to actually execute a script to do something like build a container image, and that's what we're going to be using it for. So that's not what you would deploy for like general purpose compute, but we're going to be using both of these compute services to build out the solution that we're talking about today. Okay. So here, let's just kind of go in and talk about these two services. Because again, I want you to understand why we're picking what we're picking. And here's the thing, as always, if you have a question, throw it into the Q&A, right? And sometimes I'm kind of moving around a lot, so I might not pick up on it right away, but we'll dive into it if you do have a question. So with Cloud Run, Google kind of says, hey, if you just want to develop and deploy a highly scalable containerized application, and if you're using one of these languages, Go, Python, Java, Node.js, .NET, and more, then you can do this on a fully managed serverless platform. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, when we're talking about a serverless platform, that means that they're going to completely own, and by they, I'm saying Google, is going to completely own this underlying infrastructure, right? We don't have to do it. We don't have to configure this completely. Out of the box, it's going to work for most use cases. Now, if you knew that you were going to have, 1 million people coming to your site within a 5-minute period tomorrow, you might want to look at some other options because of the ability to handle such rapid scaling patterns. But for most use cases, and listen, I'm going to be honest with you, even a lot of businesses that I know that are running on Google Kubernetes engine, to be honest, something like Cloud Run could handle the use cases that they have. So don't think of this as just, a beginner service. That's not the case at all, right? This is a service that can handle most of what you can throw at it. And so Google actually defines the use cases where Cloud Run works well. So the first is APIs and microservices. So that's great because that's what we're doing today, right? So this is what we're going to be building here. So if we want to do a normal like HTTP based API, then we can do this with Cloud Run. We also can do something like websites and web applications or event driven processing. Now we're going to talk about this a little bit at the end when we talk about next steps and other things that you can build with this. So that's kind of what gets us, let me say that again. It's what's going to give us the things we can start to build in the future on top of what we're building today. So with all of that said, I want to show you something. So here, let me go ahead and bounce back over here into my browser. And what I want to show you is that we're going to be building off of a Git repository here. Now, this is the Git repository for this episode. And this is going to give you all the information that you need here. So this is, if you want to actually get access to this, I think we're going to be pasting the link in just a minute. That's going to be in the chat as well. But this particular Git repository is going to give us a containerized application. And this application is actually an API. This API actually goes in and pulls down real data about COVID, and you can run queries to get like COVID data for a specific location on a specific day, just as an example. So that is a good example of what is possible with just a very simple API. Now this is actually built using Node.js, and what I want to do is I want to show you everything with this. So if you're starting, as I mentioned before, and maybe you haven't done any of this before, I'm just going to go ahead and walk you through how you would go build this yourself. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go in here and fork this repository. So I have a button up here that says fork. I'm already signed into my account, and I'm going to go in and say, yes, I want to fork this under my account, which is just David Tucker, and I'll create this particular fork. Now I actually have my own version of this repository that I can actually work and build off of. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to copy the actual SSH URL that we have for this, or URI, and then I'm going to go into the terminal. Now here within the terminal, I'm just going to say that I want to git clone that, and that's actually going to pull this repository down. Okay, so now I actually have this. So I'm going to change into that. And here we are. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use VS Code. Now, do you have to use VS Code for this? No, you don't have to, but there's some reasons why I think it's going to be helpful to use VS Code to work with this. And I'm also going to use a VS Code extension called Thunder Client to actually help us test this so that we understand what's going on with this particular API. So we'll do that in just a second. So what do I do here to get this into VS Code? I'm just going to say code and then dot. That's going to say in the current directory. So here we go. Now we are actually inside of VS Code and we have our repository ready to go. So here I want to actually test this out. So what I can do here to test this out, I'm going to go ahead and open up a new terminal here inside of this particular VS Code instance, and I'm going to go ahead and run a code. I'm just going to say npm run docker and start. So this is going to go through and just handle building and then actually running this particular container. And this is actually going to be running on port 49,000. Okay, so I want to test this out before we even worry about getting into GCP. So here's how we're going to do this. I've installed Thunder Client, as I mentioned earlier. And so if I click on this, oh, thank you for pointing out that my screen's not showing. That's a mistake on my end. Sorry about that. So here, just to reiterate, since I missed that part, I ran npm run docker start, okay? And what this then enabled me to do is to basically just spin up this particular Docker container. So I'm actually running this container image. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over here to Thunder Client, which is the bottom option that I have here. Now, I have actually configured some basically API tests already. These are here under collections. Now, they're not going to be included for you by default. Not a worry. You can go here and just click import. And if you look in the repository under tests, you'll be able to see that there is a COVID API test and a COVID API test environment. So if you actually bring those in, first the environment, then you can go in and bring in the collection and you just import those from here. So in this case, I'm going to say import bulk. Now I'm going to define this environment, and I've already specified here that we're going to be running this from localhost. We're going to be running it on HTTP and port 49,000, okay? So now I can go over here under collections, and I'm just going to go here for COVID API test, and I'm going to say run all. So now that I've got that pulled up, I can simply hit run, and we can see that all of our tests pass, okay? So let me just show you, for example, what this is actually doing. So let's say here that we want to get data for country on date. So I can actually click into here, and we can see what it's returning. In this case, and sorry, this is getting crowded here on the screen since I've got everything zoomed in. Let me move this up a bit. We can see here that we're pulling up the United States, for example, on this date, and we can see all the COVID data for that specific date. Okay, so this is working for us. We're able to verify that this is running locally, but that's not what we want, right? Ultimately, what do we want? We want this to run in the cloud. We want this to be able to scale based on the demand that we have. We also want the ability to keep this up to date, because if we choose to go in, for example, and update our API, we want that to automatically go from our repository and deploy it out into Google Cloud. And we want that to happen seamlessly. And as we get to later, we might even want to do some fancy things with how we deploy so that we can do things like splitting traffic between multiple revisions. And again, in case you don't know this, I just want to call out that there was a time not too far in the past where all of this was just crazy difficult to do. But now with these kinds of services, this is possible for you to learn and for you to implement on the projects that you're working on. And it's so much easier than it used to be. So again, that's just the old man talking here. I just wanted to call out that these services give us a ton of power that we didn't used to have. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys my screen again. And I'm going to go ahead and close this out. And I just want to call out a few things here. We do have a Docker file that's already configured. It's really not doing much at all. It's basically just saying we want to install the dependencies, and then we're going to run index.js. This entire API fits inside of this one file that's only about 115 lines of code, and that includes comments. So if you want to get in and really understand what's going on, you can dive in, and I've tried to have some comments in there that really help you understand what we're doing, okay? So now that we've done all of that, now we need to go ahead and start the process of getting this integrated into the Google Cloud Platform. So that's what we're going to be working on. So let me go ahead and just run you through kind of a quick outline of what we're going to be covering. So first, we're going to go ahead and talk about what you need to do to set up a GCP account if you don't have one. And then after we set up the GCP account, we're going to go in and create our very first service inside of Cloud Run. Then after that, we're going to go in and connect it in with GitHub, and then ultimately we're going to talk about how we do some advanced customization on what we've deployed. Okay? Sound like a plan? Good stuff. Here we go. Let's go ahead and dive in and do it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show you my screen in just a second. Here, I've got my browser pulled back up, and I want to call out a few things. First of all, I want to talk briefly about pricing, because one of the big fears that I know developers have is, hey, I'd love to start working in the cloud, but with that being said, I don't want to have these huge costs that show up, right? And I know that's a big concern, but I want to call out a few things about GCP so you're aware. GCP offers initial credits when you create a new account. I'll show you the link to that in just a second. But on top of that, with Cloud Run, we also have an initial set of basically free requests that we get every single month, okay? So if you look here on the page, we can see that all Google Cloud customers get 2 million requests per month completely free of charge when they're using Cloud Run. Now, Cloud Run's not the only service we're using, and so there are some small costs, but here, I want to give you the confidence that if you take advantage of the credits that Google Cloud provides you, and then you take advantage of things that fall into this free capability, and it's more than just Cloud Run. There's other services that provide it as well. With that being said, right, you can actually go out and try without the concern of spending a huge amount of what I know for a lot of you is your own money that you're using to learn these skills. Now, if you have an employer that's providing an account, even better. But what my hope is that, again, you'll be able to have some confidence. You won't be so fearful getting into the cloud and trying some of these things out. So if you want to set up a new account, right, you're actually able to go in here and just cloud.google.com/GCP. And within here, it's going to tell you that you can get started here absolutely for free, right? And I just want to show you what this is like. I'm not going to walk through the entire process here, but I'm going to just go through a few steps so that you're not freaked out by this process of getting a new account set up. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go in here, I'm going to select kind of one of my test accounts. And once we go in here, I don't have an account configured for this, right? So you're simply going to be able to go in and enter your country, and you can go ahead and just say, hey, you know, this is just a personal project, for example. You can agree to the terms of service. And you can see here already, it's telling me that I have a $300 credit for free. And not only that, it's saying, hey, we're not going to auto charge you after the free trial ends. Honestly, Google does a good job of helping you get started on GCP with this account. So take advantage of that. Once you get into here, you'll need to go through and do your identity verification, and you will need to enter in a credit card. So for some of you, I know that's a concern, but again, be sure you read and understand what Google is actually saying here, because in using those free credits, you're not going to have this huge bill that's going to come up at the end. So again, I just want to give you the confidence to walk through this whole process. So here, you'll have to enter in a code from your phone. The next step, you'll enter in your credit card information, and then literally at that point, you are ready to rock. You're ready to jump in. You're ready to start building stuff. So with this being said, I've already created an account. Okay, I've got a test one here. There's a few things in it. There's not a whole lot. This is kind of my personal account that I go in and mess around with stuff. And I want to call out something here to begin with, because again, you're not going to be familiar with this if you're brand new to GCP. We have the ability to select from different projects, and this can help us organize things, right? So I can go in and see, for example, that, hey, I could create a new project. So if I wanted to do one here and create a new project and give it an identifier, that's going to allow me to keep everything for this one project, all the resources I'm creating in the cloud, in one place. So that's great, but in this case, I'm just going to use the current project that I have. It's going to be easy to work with at this point. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here under search. Now, one of the things you can do, there's a lot of ways to navigate here within the console for Google Cloud. You can go to this flyout window here, or flyout menu, and you can go through and find everything. But I'm going to be honest with you, this can get a little overwhelming for some of you when you're getting started. So if you know where you're going, it can be just as easy to go up here to the top and say, okay, let me go to Cloud Run. Okay. By doing that, I'll be able to see the product page here. I can click on this, and now I'm actually inside of Cloud Run. I'm inside of the service page. Now, there's a lot of different things you can do here, a lot of customization, things like managing custom domains, which is currently in beta. We'll talk about that later. But what we want to do here is we want to go in and create our first service. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Create Service. So from here, we now start to get to all the options that are provided, okay? And again, I don't want any of this to be overwhelming. We're going to walk through this step by step so you know what we're asking for here. Now, if we were actually storing our container image inside of GCP, we could simply go in here and enter in that container image URL. This is going to be limited, again, to the two different places you can actually store container images with Google, but instead, we're not going to want to do that, okay? We're going to want to take this option that says continuously deploy new revisions from a source repository. Why would we do that? Let's talk about that for just a minute. One of the biggest hassles that we all have, right, is going through manual deployments when we make updates to applications, right? And this can be automated. This is a process, we'll hear kind of three different terms. Continuous integration. That means that every time we actually commit something into the repository, we're going to run our tests. Continuous delivery. That means that everything about the release process is automated except the actual step of telling it to deploy. And then the final one is continuous deployment. And this is where we truly deploy our new application on every commit to a specific branch in our source code repository. Now, really, anything in the cloud, your goal should be, even if it's a small side project, you want to set up some way of doing continuous delivery. There's several options on how to do this, but here it's basically built into the service. So you don't have to do the manual configuration yourself. This is one of the reasons why this is such a great service to get started with GCP. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this button that says Set Up with Cloud Build. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that Cloud Build is a compute service that's basically like a build server for us. It's going to build our container image in this case. So what we want to do is we want to set this up. So I'm going to go ahead and hit that button, and I'm going to say here, okay, yes, we're going to use GitHub. Now, here's what we need to do. We're going to manage our connected repositories, or actually, in this case, we'll hit Authenticate first. So I'm going to go in here, and it's going to say, okay, do you want this to be able to go in and do the following things? I'm going to say yes. I do. Okay, so now I'm going to actually manage the connected repositories. So I'm going to go in here and say, you know what? I only want this to work with selected repositories. I'm going to give it permission. So here, I'm just going to say that community CBL June 2022, I want to give it access to that. Great, now I hit install, and now we actually have communication that's going to exist between GCP and GitHub. So it's able to now say, hey, wait, you have permission to a repository. In this case, I'm going to say David Tucker / community CBL June 2022. Now, probably no surprise to anybody, you have to agree to some terms to make this work. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We also have some advanced options here. Mirror GitHub repository for cloud source repositories. Just don't worry with that. I know if you're like me, you always have to click advanced options to see what's there. But in this case, we're not going to worry about that. Now I'm just going to hit next. Now from here, we're going to give it build configuration. Now, in my case, I always use main as my default branch. So here, I'm specifying that, yep, main is the branch that I want. Now, the reason it has this caret at the front and the $sign at the end is it's actually using a regular expression to match this, and that's basically saying this is only going to match the actual branch that has the name main. It's not going to match, main-2 or anything else. It's just main, so that's why it looks that way. And here, we're going to say that we want it to actually build from a Docker file. And here, we're going to use the default location for Docker file because that's where we have it stored within the repository. Now I'm going to hit save. Now it is pre-configured to work with our specific GitHub repository, the one that I created just a little bit ago. I'm going to go ahead and leave this region at the default, which is US Central 1, which is in Iowa. And here, I'm also going to leave the default for CPU is only allocated during request processing. And then I'm going to set here, we'll also leave the default number. Actually, why not? We'll actually lower this down a bit. I'm going to go ahead and set this to be like 5 for the maximum number of instances. And the reason I'm doing this is, again, I want to reiterate here, I don't want you to be afraid to launch things in the cloud so that you can learn, right? I know sometimes, again, we have big fears that happen with spending in the cloud. So if you set your maximum number to 5, you're going to decrease the amount of instances that can actually be spun up. Now, next, we're going to say here that we want to allow all traffic. Okay. Now, you could specify here, maybe you have an internal application, or maybe you're using a load balancer. There's a lot of conditions that can happen. Just here to have a simple beginner example, I'm going to leave this option for allow all traffic, and we're going to say that we want to allow unauthenticated invocations. In other words, anyone will be able to call our API. Okay, now we've reached the moment where we're going to hit the big blue create button, right? We're actually going to build something in the cloud. So I see somebody here asking, is this AWS in the chat? And no, this is actually GCP, the Google Cloud Platform. There are similar services that exist between the two platforms, but this one we're in GCP. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create. I always say that, like, I'm going to have some programmed music to play while things are creating in the cloud, but I always forget to do that. So here you can just imagine whatever music that you want. But I do want to revisit here for just a minute what we've actually done up to this point. So we have a brand new, GCP account. For you, it's probably brand new. For me, this one just had a few things in it. We created a new service for Cloud Run. We tied that into our repository. It actually is authenticated with GitHub. It has access to one repository, and it knows that it needs to build off of our main branch, okay? So that's what we currently have configured. What it's doing right now is it's going through and actually setting up all of the resources that our application will need to run. And then what it's doing right now is it's actually building off of our repository. You might say, well, how do you know that? Well, it tells me right here. This is actually pending. I can even go in and look at the logs for the build process. This is going to take me over to Cloud Build, and I can see that it's actually going ahead and actually building our Docker container, and it's going to be pushing that out. So it's pulling the initial layer in first, and then it's going to push out when we're actually done. So that's what's going on right now. Now, when all of this is done, we're going to have a URL that we can test, and we're going to go back into VS Code. We're going to run our same tests and verify that everything is working as intended, okay? Now, be thinking of any questions you have about how this works, because I want to be sure that we're answering those here within this episode. Go ahead and enter it into the chat, and we'll go ahead and get things going. So here we can see it's getting ready to go here. Okay, we're still building. Perfect, and we can see now that it has completed. So here we have a URL, and I know this might be a tiny bit small, so I'm going to make this even bigger. We have an actual URL. I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, and I'm going to go up here and I'm going to run this. Now, this is something called a cold start, right? So here we have an initial invocation. So it's going to need to spin up the needed resources for us. But if I go back in and I try to reload, this is going to be almost instantaneous. So you need to understand that when you're dealing with the serverless platform, it's going to spin up the resources per request. And so that means the first time you go in and take something that you've just launched, the first time you try to launch it, it's probably going to be a little bit slower. That's okay. Don't worry about it. Now, I'm going to hit raw data here. You can see that we're just returning at the root here, we're just returning something that says version 1.00. As you might guess, in a minute, we're going to update that and we're going to deploy that so we can see if this works. But here, all that looks good. So what I want to do now is I want to go back to VS Code. So here within VS Code, I'm going to go back to Thunder Client. We're going to go to the environment, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and edit this environment, okay? So here, first of all, I need to put in what our new host is. And in this case, I'm going to remove a little bit of this. Here is our host. Okay, this is a URL that's generated by Cloud Run. We can actually use our own custom domains as well. We're not going to get into that in this episode, but that is something that's there. Now, this also configures HTTPS for us. So that's done out of the box. The next thing I need to do is enter in the port, which is 443, which is just the standard port for HTTPS. And then I'm going to hit save. Now I'm going to go back under collections and I want to say, hey, let's run all these tests. Let's see how things are going. And I'm going to hit run again, and we're going to see that everything passes, meaning we fully deployed our API into the cloud, right? And I hope all of you would look at that and say, you know what? Like, I could do that, right? I could deploy that into the cloud following the steps that we've just done. And we've only gotten to like half the cool stuff with this. There's still more to come. So with that being said, I also want to call out here the response time here is pretty excellent for all these. For 2 of them, we're under 100 milliseconds, right? So this is a pretty fast response time. As opposed to being local, which we know is always going to be super fast. So we've successfully deployed it. Now here's what I want to do. I told you earlier that when we actually deployed this, we actually have a version number that's going to come back as 1.00. What I want to do is I want to actually just run an update to this in GitHub and verify that our continuous deployment actually works. Okay, so that's what we're going to be doing. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and go back over to the repository here, and I just want to call out that here there is a GitHub workflow, but that's not what actually handles this update for us. That actually does something different, which is creating a release package here. So what we want to do instead is we're going to actually do an update through VS Code, and then we're going to go over to the revisions inside of our Cloud Run service, and we're going to see if it rebuilds our application. So let's go ahead and go back to VS Code. And then from here, I'm going to go under index.js. I'm going to do a very sophisticated code update, okay? I'm going to change this to 1.1, and I'm going to save it, right? I know, mine's blown. So here, we're going to go ahead and say that, yes, we want to actually change that, and we're going to say updated version number. We're going to sync changes. Okay, and we're done. So now I'm going to go back into the browser. We're going to go over here to Cloud Run, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to specify that we want to refresh. Okay, now upon refreshing, I can see here that we are actually building, right? So I can go here under build history, and I can see that we are currently building our new build. So the continuous deployment did work from our GitHub repository. So now we should be able to effectively see our new version come up once this is actually done, okay? So we actually have that in place. I'm gonna go ahead and now just specify to go back. And I want to call out something here about revisions, because this is going to come into play in just a minute. Here on the left, we currently have 2 revisions. We have a placeholder revision, and this was the revision that basically was just created when we created our service. And then we have here our first one. Okay, this is the main revision that we had up and running that was deployed 5 minutes ago. And we should have a new one that shows up here in just a second. We can see now it's showing this one, and it's saying that it was deployed just now. So it's finalizing the process as we speak. So I see somebody's asking about Thunder Client. This is probably a good time just to kind of revisit that really quick. So if you look under and this is helpful for everybody, if you look under the instructions for inside of the GitHub repository, we do have a link for Thunder Client for VS Code. That's where you can install it. And as I mentioned earlier, there are files included in the GitHub repository that you can import for Thunder Client. And I covered that just a little bit earlier on the video. But that's a great question. But now we can see that we do have our latest version actually installed. So if I go back here and I say, okay, version, and I hit reload, we're going to see in just a second, once this actually runs, and again, we're doing another cold start because we just had a deployment, we can see that now it's going to give us our new version of 1.1. So again, we successfully deployed from GitHub. What were the manual steps required for deployment? Nothing. We didn't have to do anything, right? So if we're building this as a part of our team, we simply make our commits. It'll run any tests if we have that configured, and then it's going to go through the process of actually deploying our Cloud Run application. So all of that's done. Now, you might look at that and say, okay, David, right? But what if we want to do something fancy? What if this basic deployment is not enough, right? What if we actually want to look at some of the more advanced features of Cloud Run? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we're going to do just that. So I want to hit on a few things that you can do. So let's talk for a minute before we actually dive in to do anything here. So one of the things you can do here is you can actually go in and adjust the traffic per revision. We'll do that in just a second, okay? We also have the ability to use something here called event arc triggers. So what this means is you can actually go in and let's say you want to trigger based off of something, like something in storage or otherwise that you want to have processing happen within your Cloud Run application. Well, you can do that with an event arc trigger. This is what enables what we call event-driven processing. And just like we have on the other cloud platforms, we have a great way to do that here with Cloud Run. We also have the ability to go in and configure metrics that we expect to be true, what we call SLO, service level objectives, for our Cloud Run application. And if something falls outside of those ranges, then we could actually have an alert get sent to us. And so we're going to talk about these 3 different things that we can do with that. So here, let's go ahead and look at the first one of these, which is actually adjusting the traffic per revision, okay? Now again, I want to call out, you don't have to do this, right? All of the things that we're going to cover from this point on are just customizing what's already there. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen again so you can see it. Now from here, if we want to actually do this, we can say manage traffic. And here's what I want to say is that we're going to say that we're going to do, let's say we're going to do half of our traffic on the most recent release. And we'll even just say, hey, latest healthy revision. And then for the second one, we're going to do the previous revision. And let's say we want to split this 50-50. So let's go ahead now and save. So once we actually finish this, it's going to take a little while for it to deploy this. We're going to be able to go in and we're going to be able to jump in here and verify that we're actually splitting traffic between these two, right? So if I go in and let's say I just do a reload on this, there we go. I've got version 1.0 and reload 1.1, right? 1.0, 1.1, back and forth. And we're able to do this because we are splitting the traffic between 2 different revisions within our Cloud Run application. Now, some of you might look at this and say, why would I ever do that? And that's a great question. Let me explain that one of the things you can do with an application that you're deploying is you can actually only expose a certain number of users to the new version of the application, maybe like 10%. Why would you do this? Well, sometimes you want to test out deployments before you choose to basically migrate all the traffic to the new version that you're deploying. And that is something that you can do utilizing Cloud Run. It's a great feature that's included. Now, I'm going to go ahead and go back here to manage traffic. I'm going to choose to go in and actually reset this. We're going to say that our latest healthy revision will get 100% and we'll do 0 for the other, right? And with that, we'll hit save, and now we don't have to worry with it anymore. It's always going to be the latest version. So here, we're actually going to deploy that, and that'll be updated here in just a second. Now, that's just one thing that you can do. I also mentioned that we have the ability to have different triggers, right? So here, we could look in and going in and adding an event arc trigger. And this could be, everything from, if we're looking at, the AI platform, we could go down and look at App Engine. I mean, you can see all the different ways that we can actually trigger our Cloud Run application based on something else that's happening within our GCP account. Now, this is extremely powerful because this enables you to truly build these modular applications. So, hey, I do this over here, this other thing runs, this other thing happens, this other thing happens, and this is powerful. So event arc triggers are something that I would encourage all of you to take a look at if you're looking at building event-based applications. You also now have the ability to go in and look at what I call SLOs, right? Service level objectives. So let's say we want to go in and create a new SLO. And let's say that we want this to be based on availability, right? And let's say that it's a request based. We could go in and specify here that we want to actually have a performance metric tied around availability. We can already see what our values are so far. We can see what our actual lag is on response. And then we could go in and set a specific, what they call compliance period. So in this case, we're going to say, yep, let's do a, say a rolling one, let's say every, 1 day. And we could go in and set a performance goal for, our availability. That's just an example. We won't set that up right now, but that's another example of what is built in. Previously, again, you'd have to build in all these observability triggers for your service, and Cloud Run has actually made it quite a bit easier to get those set up than what we have with previous services. So this is just another area that makes it work quite a bit easier when you're dealing with Cloud Run. So you might say, okay, well, what else can I do, right? What are the other things I can do with Cloud Run? And that's a great question here, because we're going to kind of start to wind things down here. We've really accomplished all of our goals, but there's some great features that are now in beta and preview on Cloud Run that you can take advantage of and test out, like custom Cloud Run mapping for domains. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to use your own domains and not the one that was generated by Cloud Run, you can do that, right? If you want to go in and do things like utilize the second generation execution environment, you can do that as well. That's one of the advanced features when you go to set it up that gives you some additional capabilities. They're also looking at jobs and file store and all of these things. So with that said, you can go in and really begin to build out the next generation of your application with this service. Now, here's the catch, right? One of the things that we want to do with Cloud Builder Live is we want you all actually building based off of what we teach. So here's what I'd love to see. I'm going to throw out the gauntlet. I'm going to throw out a challenge for you all. I want you guys to actually go in. I want you to follow along with this tutorial. I want you to deploy this yourself. And then I want you to be able to let me know how you're doing. You can do that inside of the Discord where you can follow along. We do have a Cloud Builder Live channel. You can let me know how it's going, right? You can also reach out to me if you want to on Twitter, for example, at, _ David Tucker _ and just let me know how you're doing with this, because I would love to hear what your experiences are, because at the end of the day, I'm doing this because I want to see you guys gain, you all actually gain skills that you can go out and you can apply in your jobs. That's what really gets me excited. And you can maybe even get new jobs and new opportunities because of that. So let me revisit a couple of things here really quick. So first of all, again, if you want a short link so that you can actually get in to the repository that we mentioned here, you can follow this particular link, and this will take you to the GitHub repository. And with that being said, you can go ahead and start the process of building along just with what I did. So you can go back and follow along with the video again. And with that being said, it'll give you the opportunity to deploy the API just as we did in this episode. Okay. So let me go ahead and dive into a couple questions here. So somebody asked here, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my screen. So somebody had asked about the compute capabilities. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. I'm going to go in and pull my screen back up here. And I'm going to go ahead and say that we want to actually create a new service. So here, I'm going to say that we want to go in and create a new service, and I'm going to use this to kind of help illustrate the point. So if we look at the actual if you look at the actual configuration that we have, with the free tier, you gain the ability to actually follow, again, with your first, what it says, 180,000 vCPU seconds per month and first 360,000 memory seconds per month. So with this being said, again, this gives you up to 2 million requests, and this is what's covered under the free tier. Now, we do have the opportunity to go in and configure quite a bit more. So if I go down here, if I scroll down here under the options for container, variables, and secret connections and security, we didn't cover these in the episode because this was going a little bit deeper. But if you look in here, we're able to go in and configure things like what our memory is and what our CPUs are. So if we wanted to go in and say, you know what, we want 16 gigs, right? And we want to actually do, let's say, 8 CPUs, we could configure that, right? Now, that's going to cause the free tier that we have and our request to go through and be used quite a bit faster, right? So we need to understand that there are implications to that. Here, this is where you also can set the execution environment. As I mentioned, the second generation, which is now in preview, has a lot of additional capabilities, including file system access and the like, that you can dive in and use a bit more. But again, that was kind of beyond the scope of what I was talking about here. But that is a great question. This is configurable. You can give it the amount of memory that you think is really effective for your particular workload. And by doing that, you're going to make sure that it's right-sized for what you need. Now, it does require you to go in and set this. This isn't something that is going to basically scale those required resources. What it will scale is it will scale the number of instances based on how you've configured it here. Inside of the auto scaling settings, you can specify how it actually scales accordingly. So again, you want to be able to scale horizontally, meaning that we're adding more instances. That's generally what we do in the cloud, as opposed to scaling vertically, where we're simply adding more resources to the servers that we're working with. But we do have to start with a great baseline of resources for the particular server that we're actually going to be running this on. So that is a great question. Okay. Any other questions? I will do one more thing just since it was asked, and I think this was already figured out, but I just want to call it out. I don't want to leave anything missed here. When you are in Thunder Client, to actually get this to show up correctly, I'm going to go ahead and bring my screen back up. You can actually click on Thunder Client here on the left, and then under Collections, and you can say Import. Now, what are you going to import? Well, if you look here under Tests, we actually have a collection and an environment, okay? We want to generally do the environment first, and then we're going to bring in the collection. And we want to be sure within our collection, we actually specify the specific environment that it works with, right? So we go under settings here, and we're going to specify the environment, which in this case is going to be our COVID API test environment. And then once we do that, we're able to go in and configure our environment. And with that configuration, it'll point it to the right place so that we can test things out. So you could absolutely do the same thing with something like Postman. I just, in doing Cloud Builder Live, I want to be sure that I'm not asking people to install 20,000 things before every episode. So since I know a lot of people are in VS Code, we just use Thunder Client to make that a bit easier, but you can use whatever tool you want. You can go in and see those tests the way they're defined within Thunder Client, and then you could choose to replicate that in your platform, or just find a platform that actually takes that import directly. So great. Awesome. I don't think we have any more questions. So listen, I'm thrilled that all of you chose to join me here for Cloud Builder Live. Remember, I've given you a challenge to go out and build this for yourself and let me know how you're doing with it. Thank you for joining for this month's episode of Cloud Builder Live, covering GCP.